Yes, Surrender. Okay. Okay, fine. Sure, I'll do that. We don't see any attendees that have joined, isn't it? Or we don't see the attendees.
The attendees have started coming in.
Yes, they started coming in.
Yeah.
But we don't see them from our side.
That's right. You just see the numbers where it says participants. That's about it, yeah.
I don't see even the numbers.
Right at the bottom center.
Under participants, I've got
Yeah, under participants.
12 and rising.
Yeah, there is panelists and then there is attendees, so you should see them all.
George, if you just slide your screen at the bottom.
Okay.
Just move the cursor. Maybe it will see this.
Sorry. Okay. So they are here, and the participant 16. So shall we wait for a number to assemble, or? We have 1 minute.
We still have a minute left.
16 have joined.
So just give it a minute and then we'll start. It's building up.
Good evening, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight, long-awaited night with James Grinnell. James is a big supporter for industry. He has been heavily involved in district cooling for many years. James is a utility professional with 20 years of experience gained across the UK, EU, and Middle East, working with a regulatory and supervisory bureau for electricity and water sector in Dubai. James received and implemented regulation to support Dubai clean energy strategy with a particular focus on IWPP, Energy Service Company, ESCO, and district cooling. Prior to joining the RSP, James held a number of high-profile positions in UK water companies, influencing the development of regulation for price reviews, competition, asset management, and water resources management. James holds a PS honor in civil engineering, is an alumni of London Business School, and a certified energy manager. With that, also on this evening has been hosted all ICPI. We are also going to be joined by Mr. Surrender, the editor-in-chief of CPI of Climate Control, and assisted by Mercy. And they will be collecting your question. I encourage all of you to post your question early on. We will have a break in between the presentation of James, and we will try to answer all your questions. Please do so as quickly as you can. Whenever you have a question in mind, post it, and Surrender will take it. With that note, please welcome James, and the floor is yours, James.
James, you're muted, so you can unmute yourself, please.
Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Good, sorry about that. Welcome to the evening where we can talk about the implementation of regulations for district cooling. What we've got on the agenda this evening is a two-part presentation. We will look at a strategic overview for the district cooling regulations that we're looking to implement. A quick look at the Executive Council Resolution 6 of 2021, what that contains. And a little step back to look at why we're trying to regulate, what are the benefits we're trying to seek from regulations. And then we'll take a look at the form of the regulatory regime. And then I think we'll have an opportunity for some questions. We'll take those in terms of questions of a strategic nature about the regime before we step into part two, which I'll be looking at each part of the regulatory framework. I will talk about the status of each of those documents, what's contained in them in a summary form, and we'll be able to have a short discussion on each of those sections in terms of what's going on, where we're at, and where we're going with each document. So we'll be able to have questions as we go through that part two. So without further ado, I'll just touch on a brief history of the RSB for those that aren't aware of it. It was established by Executive Council Resolution 2 of 2010. And at that time, it was first responsible for the regulation of the IWPPs for the electricity and water sector. And Law 6 of 2011 was passed to support that regulatory framework. And that's actually been implemented with quite some success. We now license a significant proportion of Dubai's electrical generation capacity through the items like the Sheikh Mohammed Sheikh Mohammed solar park out at Al Quoz. Since then, we've also provided support to the DSM strategy, and we have voluntary accreditation schemes, including ESCOs, energy auditors, and something I'll touch on later on, building energy management accreditation. So it wasn't until March this year that Executive Council Resolution 6 of 2021 was published, and that is the document that's the subject of this evening's webinar, really, the establishment of a framework to regulate district cooling in Dubai. So what does it contain? it basically sets out a requirement that anyone who's providing district cooling services must be authorized by the RSB. And those people would be people that provide district cooling and people that provide billing services, and we call them billing agents. The powers that have been granted to the RSB under this resolution include setting technical standards, things like energy efficiency, service standards, and so forth. Prescribing measures for companies to take where customers fall into payment arrears, resolving disputes between customers and permit holders, and indeed between permit holders if they arise, and approving the basis on which district cooling charges are implemented, and that's including the content of the bill. Now, the Supreme Council of Energy is the entity that it has the responsibility to approving the actual charges and tariffs levied by district cooling. So the RSB has the role of just setting the format for those charges and bills. One of the key parts of the legislation that we'll talk about is approving standard contracts to be entered into, and that's between permit holders and customers. And in terms of managing disputes, a bit more detail, but we are required to approve DC providers' complaint handling processes. And finally, we're required to adjudicate where a DC provider objects to another's right-of-way application to the RTA. The ECR was published on March the 29th, 2021, and it includes at the end of it a compliance period of a year, after which all DC service providers and billing agents must comply. So that it means that basically we have to have this regulatory framework in place, and participants or those providing district cooling services or billing services need to have obtained their permits and aligned with contracts and aligned their tariffs or sought approval from the council for those tariffs by that date. Just stepping back on why we're doing this. The demand side management program that was first established back in 2012, I believe, recognized district cooling as a key area where energy savings could be made. And it envisaged an increased penetration of district cooling that would deliver improvements to the energy efficiency in Dubai. Now, in order to do that, the district cooling sector needed to be seen as cost effective, providing good service, and showing environmental benefits. And shortly, an assessment after that DSM program was published, we found that in terms of cost, there was a high capacity estimate that was prevalent in the sector, and that meant that customers typically paid for more capacity than they used. There was a significant occurrence of billing agent markup, meaning that charges were higher for some customers, and there was significant variability between district cooling providers for their charges, and that may well continue to be the case. We haven't really established whether that's justified or not, so we're not sort of passing judgment on the variation of charges between district cooling providers at this stage. In terms of service, it was getting a bit of a bad rap. Low metering penetration meant that customers really didn't control their bills. They couldn't set their thermostats a bit higher and enjoy a lower bill. There are very few published service standards or commitments from providers to customers, and complaints that were often escalated to the RSB or the council even, we found that were unresolved. In terms of the environmental performance for district cooling, we have electrical efficiency. Now, district cooling is predicated on electrical efficiency, and indeed, on average, it is from the data that I've seen, the most efficient form of cooling where there is sufficient density in the development. But across the systems, we have seen electrical efficiency that is variable, And that means that there is room for improvement in electrical efficiency performance. And the same goes for water efficiency. And in terms of water efficiency, district cooling drives a significant part of the demand for desalinated water. And that's a seasonal demand as well. So in the summer, that demand goes up just when the peak water is occurring as well. So it's coincidental with the natural peak for the system. And finally, the use of recycled water, although it's improved over recent years, there is opportunity to increase the use of recycled water and thus reduce the impact of demand for desalinated water on the DEWA system. So there are improvements that we can, I believe that we can make to the sector, but importantly, what we need to do in delivering the DSM objectives is to establish a sustainable sector. And that means that the three main parties to district cooling all enjoy the benefits that it brings. That means that district cooling providers need to be able to attract investors. They need to be able to deliver reasonable returns to maintain that investment input into the sector and continue to grow. Customers really need to believe and see that value proposition that district cooling offers. And that means giving them good service at efficient prices. And developers who are often choosing district cooling, or the decision point for district cooling, need to choose district cooling from the range of technology that's available. And that means that district cooling needs to be attractively priced for them to meet their needs. So we have to keep these three things. And I use this slide in almost every presentation when I talk about district cooling, because it's absolutely central to our objectives when we regulate the sector. Having a look at the regulatory framework and how it comes together, we have the Executive Council resolution, and that sets out broad parameters of the regime, who needs to do what, when, who has powers, and the obligations on those people as well. That's not expected to change for some time. And permits are issued which give permission to those stakeholders, to those market participants to carry out the regulated activities, and those permits have conditions. Those conditions are subject to amendment, and that can happen slightly more frequently than perhaps change to the Executive Council resolution, for example. So it's a level down from the ECR. And underpinning those permits are the regulations themselves. They contain the detailed provisions which permit holders must be compliant with. And they're really what we're going to spend most of this evening's session talking about. Now, to give you an overview of the way the implementing regulations are structured, I just want to talk through some of these. We have an implementation plan, and this is a very high-level summary of it. And what we've issued, what we've got at the top there is the criteria for permits and schedules, and the permit itself. That's a DC permit and a billing services permit that's available. Then we have a couple of things which we won't probably go into detail so much this evening, but the DSG has established a complaint handling committee to manage complaints that are escalated from service providers or billing agents' own systems to the DSCE. So the DSCE has already established a process to handle those complaints, and a standing committee has been formed to deal with that. The other thing that is not within the RSB's powers, of course, is the approval of tariffs, and that is something that the DSCE will also do. The rest of it is stuff that we're going to be doing in terms of implementing regulations. So procedures for dealing with customers in arrears, we've consulted with stakeholders. The standard contracts is the subject of consultation of service providers and billing agents. And energy and water performance standards is the next sort of part of the regime that we will be looking to consult on. Connected load calculation methodology is an interesting challenge, as I mentioned earlier, with the excessive contracted load. We have already started discussions with the sector on that, but it's taking a slightly different form. So we don't know whether that will become a regulatory document, but we've started roundtable discussions with the sector to try and understand if there are, or what sort of solutions there are to manage that problem upfront in terms of getting the right estimated contracted load as schemes are built. Another one is metering, billing and standard and service charges, sorry, metering, billing and charges, and that is subject of consultation. Provision of data, how we collect and monitor data from the sector, health and safety standards and customer service standards. So what I'm going to do is step through each of those parts, and we'll talk about the detail of those, where we are and where we want to go. Apart from that, there is a outside of the regulatory regime, we've created a building energy management accreditation scheme, and this was launched earlier this year, and we've worked with the DLD and RERA to launch this scheme. And it's an important part because district cooling, the regulations that we have cover all the services that are provided from district cooling systems, and those are services that are provided to building owners, or they are billing services that are provided to occupants of units within buildings. But operation of the secondary system, that system from the ETS, for example, through to the flat or the unit or the apartment, isn't directly covered by the regulations. That falls under the building management system, and that is already regulated by RERA through service charges. So rather than complicate regulations and have any overlap or confusion here, we've worked with RERA to provide this accreditation scheme that recognizes the entities that are particularly proficient at operating secondary systems. And we've done that because there's a significant energy saving that we can achieve, or that the sector can deliver, by better operating these systems. And so it's an important part, although not part of the regulatory regime, an important part of Dubai's plans to deliver efficient cooling throughout the Emirate. So with that in mind, I'm happy to take any questions that have come up before we get into the detail of each of the regulatory areas.
Surrender, do you have any question received?
As of now, no questions, George. So you can ask your questions.
Sure. James, thank you for the effort. I know 2 years of work and consultation with all parties to reach here, and for the ambition to put these regulation forward in a greenfield area where regulation were not there. So what are the hurdles you faced during that period? How did you see consensus reached? What effort you need to put as regulatory body to bring all these parties to consensus?
It has been a long road to get to this point, and it's not surprising either. I mean, district cooling took off in Dubai in the early 2000s, and as we look at it today, if we look at cooling Dubai, I think in 2020 we had 13 billion ton hours of cooling to cool Dubai. 3 billion ton hours of that was delivered by district cooling, and with over
this is 22%.
23% of the total market, correct?
You know, it is worth mentioning here, James, that although some estimates that district cooling as installed capacity was 17%, 18%, district cooling, because it services malls, hospitals, institutions, operate longer than DX in a villa. So an actual operation, you see the ton hour of district cooling reaching 22, 23, maybe the install capacity can be like 15, 16, 17%. Do you think that?
Well, I think we've been collecting data from the major district cooling companies for several years now, and we haven't really, we've got assessments of system equivalent full load hours, but we've got limited data on unit full load hours, and that is lower. I mean, from the data that we've looked at, so over the years we've collected building level data, so apartment towers and things, to understand the equivalent full load hours, and we've got commercial information about the full load hours for hotels and malls and things. And there is definitely a difference in the cooling patterns, and full load hours are higher for hospitals and malls and so on, as you'd expect. I think nevertheless there is a high, there's an excess capacity that exists. I mean, we have in excess of 2 million tons of contracted capacity in Dubai, and for delivering, I mean, we shouldn't really need that much to deliver 13 billion tons. So there must be an opportunity to make better use of those assets to drive out a higher equivalent full load hours. And I think that's in the interests of district cooling companies and the sector as a whole, because just making better use of the assets.
And I understand also, James, that this is a first step in regulations, that these regulations will evolve in the future to cover more and more and respond to what customer aiming to more satisfaction and more coverage of the regulation to protect all concerned parties.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we've taken our time and we've got to this point in a step-by-step approach. The way that we've designed the regime as a whole, with the regulatory documents that are working alongside each other, enables us to update them as the sector develops, so that we can keep the regulatory framework up to date and relevant to the prevailing market conditions. And bear in mind that we're trying to engage a sector that has had 15, 20 years of no regulation at all. So there is there's a significant step that we're asking the existing market participants to take by coming under a regulatory regime, and that's no small task. I understand the complexities and the difficulties that companies face in complying with regulations. So we do need to take this step by step, shuri, as they say. So we will take it and we'll get there piece by piece.
James, one last question before we proceed. You know that there are regulations now also in place in Abu Dhabi. We understood also they are in Bahrain. Qatar came up with their own regulation. Did you have to consult with these entities to see, I mean, is there any commonality or with them, or can you share experience with each other, or each one worked independently?
I think the regulatory bodies in each of those areas are independent, but there has been dialogue across, and I've spoken and attended conferences, listened to the developments for district cooling, both in Qatar, in Bahrain, and in Abu Dhabi, where they seem to be the areas that are most advanced in their development of regulating district cooling. And, you know, I mean, we started early on in this. I think Bahrain was also an earlier area that was trying to work on developing district cooling. And over the time that's passed, you know, in the last 5 years or so, we've been understanding how people have got on, where they're progressing, where the market challenges are. And there is a significant commonality of the difficulties that regulators are facing in managing the sector. So yeah, there's some fairly good communication, I would say, between the Emirates and the other and the Gulf region, where district cooling is prominent. But ultimately, each regulatory body is independent. Yeah.
George, there's a question from Marcus of
Yes.
Europe, Middle East. Can I just ask that?
Please.
Yeah. So the question is there any data available on the energy water nexus for Dubai? How much energy is needed to produce the water required?
Okay, so that is a changing beast, actually. And the reason for that is the move from cogenerated cogeneration in DWA's operations to reverse osmosis. And part of the analysis that we've done in the proceeding a couple of years ago, actually, we did an assessment to work out whether it was a good idea to have water-cooled cooling or air-cooled cooling or recycled water-cooled cooling. And we found that where water is generated from cogen, i.e. it's typically a MSF approach, that comes at a higher raw energy cost, if you like, a primary energy cost. Sure. And it undermines the savings that water-cooled cooling delivers. So one of the strong priorities that we've had over the last couple of years has been to increase the proportion of recycled water that is used in cooling as a proportion of the total water demand. Because where companies take recycled water, even including applying reverse osmosis to it so they can increase the cycles that they get from the water, their efficiency is superior to those that just use MSF water. And we've used some standard analysis to carry out that assessment. But when we talked with our colleagues over in Abu Dhabi, of course, Abu Dhabi uses more of a reverse osmosis approach, so it doesn't have quite the same challenge. And that's an example, just linking to George's last question about how we've understood the challenges that each company has gone. So to answer the question, when using MSF water, district cooling is still more efficient in terms of primary energy, but only marginally. And the cost of building district cooling is sort of offset by that higher energy cost. But where district cooling is used with recycled water or RO water, then there are significant primary energy savings that can be made. And that's why district cooling is a good proposition for the high density areas in Dubai.
So James, to put it some figures, each cubic meter in RO plants today require less than 4 kilowatt hour per cubic meter, correct?
Sorry, say that again.
To produce 1 cubic meter using RO plant, we need less than 4 kilowatt hour.
Correct, yes. So
that, for example, district cooling consume around 8 liters of potable water when we use. This would translate to 0.032 kilowatt per ton, while district cooling is taking 0.9 kilowatt. Let's say this is about 3.5% of the district cooling consumption. So for people always that compared to air cooled, we are still saving 0.7 kilowatt per ton at least, and at an expense of let's say 0.032 kilowatt that is diminished in producing water when we are using potable. Of course, when we are using recycled waters, we are using the water more effectively, and despite the fact that probably sewage treatment plant requires the same power like our RO plant to treat water.
That's right, yes. I mean, I think we estimated the savings being slightly higher than the 7%, pushing towards 12% better than the air-cooled solution, maybe even 15. It was a couple of years ago that we did the analysis. But the principle of the approach is absolutely right. It's the difference between using an RO at even lower than 4 kilowatts per cube compared to MSF, which is substantially higher in its consumption.
Double the energy, maybe. Yeah. Okay, we can proceed then, James. Next.
Okay. So what we'll do, we'll look at RD01. So we've labeled each of our areas of the regulatory framework. This is a regulatory document, number 1, permits and schedules. We consulted on this document earlier in the year, very shortly after the Executive Council resolution was published. We sought approval from the DSCE, I think it was at its May meeting, and we started to invite applications for permits shortly after that. There are 2 types of permit available, one for district cooling services and one for billing services. And in our implementation, we invited billing services or billing agents to apply for a permit for billing services before we invited district cooling service providers to apply for a permit, because we felt that they were less complex and we would be able to cover off a significant part of that market before getting into the detail of district cooling services. Now, the application forms can be obtained if you just email DC Permitting. My understanding from the market intel that we have is that we have pretty good coverage and we've got pretty good communication with the majority of the sector. So if I just look at the pie charts on the right of this slide, at the moment, we've identified 13 service provider companies that are operating in the sector, and we've identified 12 billing agent companies operating in the sector. And in terms of the application, 10 of those 13 service providers have made applications for a permit to provide district cooling services, and 6, so half of the billing agent side, has made applications for the permit. Now, that might seem a bit topsy-turvy to what I just said about inviting billing services to billing agents to apply for a permit first, but actually it's not. The reason that we have a greater proportion of applications from service providers is that we've pretty much known the companies involved in district cooling service providing over the years of engagement during the preparation of these regulations. And in terms of billing agents, that's been a bit, we've had less visibility of that. And actually, probably at the turn of the year, we maybe only knew of half a dozen or a few more billing agents. So that we've had more billing agents come forward and inquire about the need for a permit, and indeed are engaged in preparing their applications. So in terms of the applications from the companies that we know about, that's progressing quite well in my mind. The form of the permit is 1 permit per company, but a company might be a special purpose vehicle. So there might be several companies that we would think to be one entity. So that's why we have an understanding of 13 service providers, which might seem a bit high considering we've typically known 5 maybe district cooling companies in Dubai. And in terms of RD1 and the content of it, the RSB designates systems as district cooling systems. So one of the age-old problems for regulators in this area is, at what point does a cooling system become a district cooling system? Is it when it's serving more than one building? Is it when it's serving, or it's got more than 5,000 tons of installed capacity? Is it a limit of the contracted capacity? And there is an endless sort of array of parameters that you could use to try and define this. And rather than do that, we've been permitted to define these where we see it appropriate. And that means that typically we've defined, and we've started already, we've defined all of the systems that have been operated by what we know as the big 5 district cooling companies in Dubai. They've been defined as district cooling systems, and they're covered then by the regulations. Where there are smaller systems that are on the brink, if you like, that might be the source of a high level of consumer complaints or high charges, or something where it's a small part that has a big negative impact, if you like, on the reputation of district cooling, we then have the ability to designate those systems as district cooling systems up to a point. And then they fall under the regulations. Now, there is a limit there. There has to be a district cooling plant and a network, and it has to be a commercial arrangement where district cooling services are commercially available. But beyond that, there is a significant sort of flexibility in terms of designation of systems. But once a system is designated as a district cooling system, all services provided from that system must be permitted. And I'll just touch on this this last chart on the right here. We've actually had just one board meeting that we've gone through since we launched since we received first applications. So we've approved permits for 5 billing agents, and they have received their permits, and we will be publishing those permits as we do for IWPPs on our website in due course. We haven't done yet. We've got some internal things just to finish off before doing so. But generally, the high-level permit itself will be published on our website. When I look at the impact of this, it's early days, but we have had a bit of an impact already, and it's good to see that the regulations are having a bit of a positive impact. And what we've done is we had applications from billing agents to provide billing services, and they told us of the arrangements for the buildings that they're servicing. Now, back in December 2020, the Supreme Council of Energy issued a directive where the fuel surcharge was reduced, and this was something that DEWA did back last year. And the DSE asked all those providing district cooling services to reduce that fuel surcharge. And in the course of the applications, we found that some buildings were being served who hadn't passed through that reduction in the surcharge. If you bear in mind, back in December 2020, we only had visibility of the major district cooling service providers, and of course, they did that. So it was perhaps the building owners that were paying district cooling companies on the basis of a reduced fuel surcharge, but then charging occupants and unit owners within that building, or getting their billing agents to charge those units and occupiers on the basis of the old fuel surcharge. So what we did is we refused to issue schedules for those buildings where that was the case. And the reaction that we got was incredibly positive. The billing agents engaged their clients. They went back. The clients understood the issue at hand and made the reduction. And the result of that is that the cooling charges levied on end users will be more than 1 million dirhams less per year, already just from the 5 permits issued already. And I expect that to grow as we go through the rest of the year with the permitting process. So 1 million dirhams a year, it's a lot of money in my mind, but it's a small step in the scale of district cooling in Dubai, but it's a step in the right direction. And I hope that we can continue to deliver more of that. That's what I've got to say on permitting. I'll just pop back to this slide because I'm happy to take any questions from people on permits and schedules as a component of the regulatory regime. Like I said at the beginning, I think that we've got most people covered in terms of the companies, but if there are any other inquiries or questions on this area, then I'd be happy to take them.
Any question, Surendra, from the audience so far?
As of now, no, George.
Okay, and so we have the 5 major district cooling provider already permitted. If any,
sorry, George, just to clarify that, the 5 billing agents have got permits for billing services. Okay. There are 10 service provider applications currently in progress, and they'll be going through to our board in the near future.
If a new provider want to come to Dubai, what is he required to do, James?
Well, the Executive Council resolution requires that anyone wishing to provide district cooling services requires or is obliged to get a permit before he does so. So in terms of new entrants, and we have had discussions with investors interested in exactly this, in entering the market in Dubai. They've come to us since this Executive Council resolution has been published, and they've inquired about what's needed for them. Are they under any obligation before acquiring district cooling plant or a district cooling systems, for example? And the key thing really is there is a fair amount of M&A activity going on in the market at the moment. I think anyone who reads the cooling press will know about that. And where that's the case, I mean, these regulations, the Executive Council resolution is live, and it's been live since March the 29th. But this grace period allows people to carry on. They only need to be really compliant by the 29th of March 22. So if someone was to buy a cooling system now, that could go through, and the new entrant would be able to apply for a permit between now and March. If they bought that system after March 22, then they would have need to have obtained a permit upfront, or the permit would need to be transferred if it's from an existing licensee.
Do you see any restriction for newcomers?
I hope not. Regulation is inherently, it is something that requires a bit of a burden in terms of reporting, and people have to apply for a permit, and that means they have to gather information. And we've tried to keep that as light as possible, really to ensure that the people that apply for permits are competent and able and have the correct resources to be able to deliver a district cooling service. So, for example, when we look at the application forms for permits and schedules, well, our approach because we're trying to engage a sector that has been in action for over 15 years already, we've made some presumptions, and it means that for those big service providers that are applying for a permit, we've understood that they have the capability to run district cooling systems, and we haven't had to delve too much into whether they are competent to do that. We know that they do that, and they've been doing it for some time. So that's enabled us to be fairly swift with our assessment in that area of permits. But for new entrants after March, we would be carrying out a proper diligence of whether the applicant was appropriately qualified to carry out district cooling services.
George, there's a question again from Marcus of Euro and Middle East, and the question is, why no service providers have received permits yet?
Well, it's simply a matter of timing. So the service providers, I mentioned earlier that we asked for applications from billings agents before applications from service providers because we felt they would be easier to deal with. And we've been able to issue some permits for those 5 that you see there. But despite that, when we invited applications from district cooling service providers, we have received 10 applications, and they are already in the process. And I very much hope to be issuing permits to a number of those in the very near future. So they're the subject of our future board meeting. And it will be for our board to approve those applications. It's simply a matter of in progress.
Okay, I think that's it for now. So we can move into the presentation.
So, regulatory document 2 concerns handling customers in arrears. It's a consultation that we completed earlier in the year. And the current status is that the document is subject to DSC approval. So it's not implemented at this stage. What are we trying to achieve by this? Well, there are 2 sides to every story. And on the one side, we're looking to prevent unfair disconnection of customers. And on the other side, we're looking to ensure that permit holders can effectively manage debt where customers don't play the system and not pay their bills because they choose not to. And in doing that, we proposed a number of steps that permit holders should go through in respect of pursuing those debts. And the right-hand side of this slide, it actually includes where we're currently at with the process. Our initial consultation document had a couple of extra clauses in it, and I'll step through this part now. So the initial part of the consult, before we went to consultation, we collected companies' policies with respect to managing customers in arrears, and we looked at it across the sector, and we found a number of areas where market participants had common practices, and indeed almost all of them had 14 days between the invoice and the due date. So we thought, well, let's make that a standard sort of approach. And payment terms, we've proposed that at least 14 days should be made available for customers to pay their bills. And then things began to change, and some companies would use penalty charges straight off the back of the 14 days. Some would allow a little more time. So what we've tried to do is provide a balanced approach that enables companies to be a little bit flexible in their approach, to recognize their own brand in the market, if you like, but also to make sure that customers have some protection. So we've said penalty charges shouldn't be used until, or mustn't be used until, an account is at least 7 days overdue. And in addition to that, a reminder notice must have been issued. Now, that reminder notice might be before the due date, it might be after the due date, but it has to be issued before a company makes any penalty charges. And the next thing that is typical for the sector is suspending services. Now, we've obviously, this may not be done where it's prohibited by law, and we've looked for quite some time at the legislature for evidence of where things, where there is advice or rules that prevent or allow suspension of services. The only part that we found is in relation to landlord-tenant activity. So in that case, obviously, the law does not allow disconnection. It's a RERA law from some time back. So in terms of our approach on suspending services, or the procedure that we're recommending, if companies choose to take that approach, they must have issued at least 2 reminder notices and issued a final notice no earlier than 14 days after the due date. And if you add the 72 hours before the service is suspended, I think you get close to 28, excuse me, 28 days, 31 days from the invoice to service suspension if the customer is not responding to that incentive.
Which is good.
Now, sorry, go on, George.
Which is good, I guess.
Okay.
It's a good period.
I think it's a reasonable balance. Now, when we were consulting on our original document here, we proposed a couple of additions. We had a step before suspending services. We said that, I mean, when we collected data from companies, some of them offered payment plans, and we thought that was a really good customer-orientated approach to managing customers in arrears. And we proposed to mandate that before suspending services. And we got a pretty strong pushback from the sector. Now, whilst I'm a fan of offering payment plans, I understood the pushback that we received, and there was some strong justification that they offered in their responses. So there was a really good value consultation process in this respect, and we haven't pursued the requirement to offer a payment plan as a result of that consultation. And the other thing that we've recognized from the feedback in consultation was we had initially proposed a restriction on carrying out any suspensions between June and September, i.e. between the hottest summer months of the year here in Dubai. Again, the sector came back to us with some pretty reasonable examples and reasons why that was not the optimal solution to managing customers in arrears. And again, we've not pursued that part. So where we've landed is we made a proposal. We listened to the feedback, and we've tapered our proposals. Now, these are still proposals. They're not legal tender at the moment. They're subject to the DSE approval. And so these are still very much draft documents, but this is where we stand today. And we're proposing that period of pretty much a month between issuing the invoice and suspending services is a reasonable balance between protecting customers from unfair disconnection and allowing permit holders to manage their debt effectively. And of course, beyond suspension of service, we have the right for permit holders to use legal remedies. And then, of course, when things come back together, as hopefully they do in the end, when bills are settled, we've put in a requirement for companies to reconnect within 24 hours of that time, within 24 hours of the time the payment is made in full. We did get a bit of pushback from, I think, 1 or 2 companies in this area. I think one requested 3 days. And that's an area that, for example, we thought that 3 days was too long. If a customer has settled his bill, he should be reconnected. I think if you look at the DEWA standards, I think it's quicker than 24 hours any time of the week, for example. So that's where we are for customers in arrears. That's the content of the proposal that we're intend to make to the DSE. And happy to take any questions on that.
James, there are 2 questions, but before that, I have one myself. I saw a different approach on the low delta T penalties that are imposed by district cooling on the customers. Are the regulation planning to unify that, or how did you address that area of regulation?
So for low delta T, we consider that not to be an issue of handling customers in arrears. That is covered under a different regulatory document. I wasn't planning to go into the detail of it, but when we come to, I think it's RD6, metering, billing and charges, we cover that in that section. Excuse me.
It's coming.
Yes, coming.
Okay. So 2 questions. Can you surrender ask them from the?
Sure, George. The first question is from, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, it's Mahik Idin. And his question is, are billing agents allowed to disconnect after following approved procedure? That's the first question.
Okay, so this is a matter that some companies put into their contracts at the moment, that they give themselves a right to disconnect if customers don't pay their bills in accordance. So we haven't intervened on that. We've done an extensive search of legislation, as I was saying, and the only relevant legislation we found in respect of disconnecting services is a restriction on that where a landlord is disconnecting a tenant under RERA law. We haven't found any evidence supporting or disallowing disconnections anywhere else. So it, to my mind, has been an issue, a contractual issue between the provider and the customer. And that provider could be a service provider or a billing service provider.
Okay. The second question is coming from Khalil Isa of AHRI MENA. And his question is, how do arrears get treated by DEWA? Is it similar to RD02?
I think it is. We did do a quick read across to what DEWA does. And I think this approach is very similar.
Okay. That concludes the question. You still have a section of presentation, I guess, James?
Absolutely. So we're through. That's handling customers in arrears.
Okay.
So the next.
Sorry, there's one more question late. It's just come from Dominic McPaulin in Bahrain, the Ministry of Works, and he says, "What happens in the case of a stalemate and prolonged non-payment without disconnection? What happens in stalemate and prolonged non-payment without disconnection?
So companies have an opportunity to pursue their debts through the courts. That is always a legal action option that's available to service providers. And in terms of contracts, I think all existing contracts have provisions for force majeure or termination, and or both, I should say, actually, importantly. And in the standard contract that we'll talk about later, we do have both termination and force majeure covered in those contracts. But effectively, if there's a stalemate, then it's for the courts to resolve. They are the ultimate body in this case.
Okay.
Okay.
So we can proceed.
Okay. So regulatory document 3 is concerning energy and water performance. And we touched on some of the parameters for this earlier. We haven't put this document out for consultation yet. It will be coming out later this year. Our objective really here is to drive continual improvement and in the energy and water performance. And I mentioned the wide variation in both, but mainly in electrical efficiency of plant. And we want to incentivize some innovation in energy efficiency. And there are some companies that are more active in innovative activities than others in the sector in Dubai. And we want to encourage that as much as possible. And of course, we want to provide further encouragement for recycled water use. It is our belief that the district cooling sector has a significant incentive to use as much recycled water as possible. For a start, it's a lot cheaper than DEWA water, as you'd expect. It's recycled water. So therefore, they can reduce their operational costs by taking advantage of that, even when you add on the reverse osmosis plant that's required to support it. Nevertheless, access to recycled water is a bit of a challenge. And that is something that we're working with the Association of District Cooling Operators and Dubai Municipality to try and resolve and work on providing more access to recycled water for the district cooling sector. The content of this document is really going to be based on an outcome approach. And that means that we're going to set thresholds for electricity and water efficiency. And that's our thinking at this stage. Now, when I'm talking about the content here, this is the content of something that we're going to consult upon. And that means that if people have responses that persuade us one way or the other, then all of the content is basically subject to the influence of the consultation process, and that's as it should be. We've considered providing separate thresholds for air and water cooled systems. There are some that think we shouldn't have air cooled systems, or the air cooled system should be only temporary, for example. So there is an argument that says, why allow a lower efficiency for an air cooled system as part of the regulations? Now, there are pros and cons for each of these arguments, and we expect those to be brought out in the consultative process. The other thing that we looked at, or we were looking at with energy and water performance is building this in terms of the consumption charges. The fuel surcharge is an explicit value added to bills and implies a water and energy efficiency. So it's something that we should take account of when we look at energy and water performance. And we need to be careful with that, of course, because the tariffs are something that the DSCE approves, not us. So our mind at the moment is more on a threshold. So if you fail to meet an electricity or a water efficiency performance, then there are consequences for that in accordance with the resolution. So yeah, it's a fairly straightforward document that I'm seeing at the moment. I'm happy to take any questions on it.
what do you see today is the current efficiency of plant? Is it varying between 0.8 to 1 kilowatt per ton in district cooling industry? What is the average in your opinion, James?
The average in terms of information that we've reported and that drives savings under the demand side management program, in 2020 it was the first year that the average got below 0.9. It was 0.89 kilowatt hours per ton hour. And that was, I mean, when we look back to 2012, it was 0.97 from memory, something like that. It was quite high. There was a significant drop in 2014 to something like 0.91, 0.92, but it's been fairly flat since then. And so we've been really keen to try and do something to promote further improvement in the energy performance. And the reason that it's something that is high on the agenda for us, obviously, it's one of the key things that is the reason why we're regulating the sector. We're trying to improve the energy efficiency of cooling Dubai. But we're seeing companies that are reaching low 0.8s, even high 0.7s, I believe, with their cooling efficiency for their systems. And there are others that are close 1.2. Now, 1.2 is no better than, well, it might be a bit better than a local system.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really, to my mind, justify installing a district cooling plant and charging for those services. So it kind of undermines the argument for district cooling. And what we want to see is we want to bring that tail end in. And we think that it should be achievable to get this average down just by getting those outliers or the poorer performers up to speed.
You know, we see many of them now start trying artificial intelligence, and they are hoping to get further 10% saving. But I think their approach is slow and just small trials rather than full-fledged approach toward AI.
Yes, I mean, I've heard of AI being tested, and we know of companies that are taking this approach and trying it. It's not the only innovation that's around. So there are a number of things, and I don't want to go into any detail from of who's trying what, but the approaches have been beneficial, and some companies have a trend of improving performance that's been paying off over a period of time, and others have we've seen companies that have gone from had fairly deteriorating performance over 2 or 3 years, and then taken a major initiative on energy performance and shown real savings and really turned their systems around to deliver much better electrical and water efficiency.
If we take 3 billion ton hour as a base, and we see that they are paying utility in excess of 1.6, 1.7 billion dirham a year. So any 5% improvement, you are talking 85 million dirham a year for every 5%. So it's a big number, and I always said that if there is a better application for AI, I don't see anything better than district cooling in Dubai, as evident. There, of course, there are many other procedures like variable speed drives, like better management, like improved cooling tower performances, controlling of low delta T, better automation and visibility. All these are taking place, and but in general, I'm so thrilled and happy to see the industry moving in a few years from just 10% improvement. That's something big.
Yeah, and like I say, I hope that there is more to come.
Yes.
It certainly sounds that there is. The one note, of course, I would add is that whilst we've seen the potential for continual improvement in electricity efficiency, that's less apparent in terms of water efficiency, and that might be that we're just near a threshold which is very hard to overcome. You evolve and then you revolve, if you like, and the evolution of evaporative water cooling might be at a bit of a limit. So there are plants that operate very low. The data we've collected from district cooling companies in the last couple of years, not 2020, but 18 and 19, we looked where companies had that data at the rate of blowdown water and at the rate of basically evaporation. So the water coming in, water going down. And we looked at the evaporative rate per ton hour produced. And that it's limited data at the moment, but it's beginning to show a bit of a trend in terms of a natural sort of optimum level of evaporative.
5-6 liter per ton hour maybe is the evaporation rate, and then you need, depending what type of water you are using. If you are using potable, you are blowing down 1.5 liter. If you are using TSE, you need to double the blowdown. Or even
well, yeah. How you're treating the water whilst it's on site is key. The RO is a key factor in it all. Yeah,
it will affect as well. Okay.
We have 5 questions. Just run through those. Yes. The first one is from Marcus of Eurovent Middle East, and so Marcus is asking what kind of entities are part of the consultation process for energy and water performance.
So the consultations that we've done so far have been primarily focused on potential permit holders or permit holders being contracts or the requirements for a permit and dealing with customers. With this one, we could include stakeholders to get their views on this. Looking at the content, we're looking at the outcome efficiency of a district cooling operator. So it's not going to be so much concerned with the billing agent, but it might be very interesting to hear the views of manufacturers and suppliers to the sector. So I think there would be some value in including a stakeholder consultation for this regulatory document, as well as the district cooling service providers. And I mean, I don't mean to carve out the billing agents. I mean, if they're involved or have an appreciation of operation of the secondary system, which is crucial to the overall energy performance of the system, then we obviously would include them as a matter of course anyway.
Thank you. Second question is from Keith Levers, and he's asking, are you considering the application of capacity charge to customers, particularly in respect of the refrigerated ton calculation and cost?
Are we considering the calculation of the capacity charge to customers? So all charges are subject to DSCE approval. And so that will be a matter. So the capacity charge is a function of almost all of the systems in operation at the moment. And because of the nature of district cooling, there is, I believe, a justification to have a capacity charge as a component. I appreciate in the case of DEWA, there's not a capacity charge and we pay on consumption. But with district cooling systems, it's not the scale that DEWA is. And I believe that a capacity charge is a necessity. Now, the size of that is something that is for the DSCE to decide upon. So yes, it's certainly a consideration, and we've collected the various data from service providers in terms of what their current charges are, and we'll be advising the DSCE on the content of that. But we won't be at this step. It's not the duty of the RSB to approve actual capacity charge tariffs.
Before you go to the second question, Surinder, many audience are asking how they can post questions. Is the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom? They can press it and post questions.
Yes, there is an ask question button, so they can click on it and can post questions.
Okay. Just verify. So proceed to the second question.
Okay.
Sorry. So yes, go on.
Okay, this question is again from Mahik Hidden, and again, his question is on billing agents. And so his question is in reference to his earlier question, please clarify who will be authorized to suspend cooling in case the district cooling provider is providing invoice to whole building that is leased to large number of tenants who are invoiced by the billing agent. Can the billing agent be authorized by the owner to suspend service? The concern is that the tenant may not pay and the owner still needs to pay the district cooling provider.
It's a very good question, because maybe some also tenant might pay, some others won't pay, and the whole building get penalized. A good question, James. I mean, it's a complex situation here.
It absolutely is a complex situation, and I don't propose that we will solve all of this in the first cut. So I think, as we mentioned at the beginning, this is the regulatory documents form a regime that can then evolve as we understand how the market reacts and behaves. My experience of some of the systems operating at the moment, we've seen some evidence of, I mean, it's pretty rare, but it's very some unhealthy buildings where occupancy is extremely low, and therefore capacity charges aren't being paid. And ultimately, if the building owner doesn't generate the revenues to pay the district cooling provider, we've seen the district cooling provider shut off the services. We can't have a situation where district cooling services are provided free of charge on an unended basis. So, this is a community obligation and responsibility to ensure that they get the services they need. So it's a very difficult area and a very sensitive one, but what you're essentially asking who can do what at what stage. That is a matter for the contract between the service provider and the customer, or between the billing service provider and his unit customer. And if that contract includes provision for suspending services, then that would happen. The suspension is really something as an effective incentive for the customer to pay. And my understanding of situations where this has occurred is that the situation is often resolved following a suspension of services. So this is not the perfect outcome where we can always fix everything, but it is a way where we can resolve most of the problems as efficiently as possible. What we will do, assuming if this is passed and becomes part of the processes that are required of permit holders, then of course we would monitor the what's happening in terms of suspension of services and the effects of the regulations. And if we need to update and modify or amend these regulations, then we wouldn't hesitate to do so.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I've completely answered his question. I'm happy to him to come back if necessary.
Okay.
Sure. What we would look to do is to publish these questions and answers in the magazine, and if there are any further questions that come to us, then we'll definitely pass them on to you.
Okay.
The next question is from Khalil Isa of AHRI MENA, and his question is, will RSP get involved beyond the DCP, mainly related to the network, the energy transfer station in particular, the plate and frame heat exchanger performance, and the tertiary loop inside the buildings like AHUs and fan coil units, high delta T?
So the RSP is looking to regulate the sector with the objective of making district cooling more appealing in terms of better energy performance and better customer service. And that means that the experience of the unit occupant in many cases, maybe the majority of cases, has to be improved. So the answer is yes. I mean, the whole permitting of billing agents to carry out billing services is part of that service provided from the district cooling system, and it's not looking at regulating the district cooling system. And I'll talk a bit about that in the next one, which is on the standard contracts. But in terms of the secondary system, as we call it, after the heat exchanger plates and between the ETS and before the unit, that is not a focus of the Executive Council resolution that we're talking about today. That is the focus of Building Energy Management Accreditation Scheme that we've launched back in April. And we have a company, Engie, that's already achieved accreditation in that respect for providing services to ensure the efficient operation of the secondary system. So at this stage, the building operation is covered, and there's a reason that we're not trying to regulate this through the ECR, and it's the building owner is an entity that's generally regulated by RERA, and it's for him to for the building owner to operate that secondary system under the regulations that RERA already has. So what we're doing is we've worked with RERA to develop this accreditation scheme and promote the efficient operation of that system. It's a voluntary scheme at the moment, so it's not part of the obligations.
I think Keith has a comment also, Surinder. That you are muted, Surinder.
Sorry about that. Yes, it's more of a comment than a question, and this is from Keith Liebers, and he says, in the early days of independent billing services, RERA would not permit billing agents to cut off the service as they were not the provider.
Which is fair.
Early days. Yes.
Okay.
I think the regulations have provided some clarity over the regulatory boundaries. And like I say, the proposals on RD2 are subject to DSC approval. So we recognize the contractual realities, and we've looked at the legislature, and we have indeed discussed with RERA on these points. And I think that nowadays RERA support or allow or permit disconnection where there is an approach to the RDSC on account of someone not paying their bills. That's the feedback that I've had from the sector.
Let's move forward in interest of time, Surinder, I think.
Yeah, there are two more questions, and this is from, I don't know if we quickly take those questions. And this is from Hannah Al-Bustani, and the question is, will the RSP set out requirements for the design of new DCPs and network? And there's one more question. This is from Mahik Hidin, and he says, whose responsibility is the maintenance of ETS heat exchangers, primary and secondary site? Okay, so to answer Hannah's question, no, we won't be telling district cooling companies how to do their jobs. They are the experts at delivering efficient cooling services. We're a regulator, and we are looking for outcome-based solutions, and that's in line with the light touch approach that we've been saying that we're pursuing for a while. So in the early days, there was discussion about ASHRAE standards and how far apart your cooling tower should be, and so on and so forth. We're not going to specify, or we're certainly not intending to specify any of that at this stage, and it's not included in any of the drafts of the regulations. All we look to achieve is that you achieve a minimum energy efficiency when you produce your cooling energy. So that's that one. In terms of the heat exchangers and who's responsible for what, that is, it's another interesting question, because there are variations. So the feedback that we've had from other consultations at the moment, and in fact, I'm just going to skip on, given it's the last question. In our standard contracts, we've set out a district cooling services agreement, and I'll come back to the beginning of the slides in a second. But to answer your question, that service agreement
looked at one point to set out the obligations on district cooling providers, and the RD document that we'll talk about later in terms of metering and billing set out obligations on who was responsible for meters and so on. Now, we've had some feedback on both of these consultations, and we're processing those responses. So there is some pushback on setting out a single standard model saying the district cooling company is always responsible to feed up to the point of supply, which is on the upstream side of the ETS, for example. That, to my mind, is nice and clean. It makes the building owner responsible for management of the ETS. But if the building owner fails to do that and causes a low delta T problem, for example, then he'll be subject to the contractual provisions that are in place to deal with low delta T. So we're in the place at the moment where we're not completely decided on a standard form of accountability yet. We did have it in mind, but we're processing responses and we're considering that. So it's very much a live issue at the moment in terms of who's accountable for which part of the process. Surinder, if that's the last question on that one, I'll just step straight into this slide on standard
There's
agreements.
one more, but we can ask afterwards.
Go
maybe.
on, yeah, go on then, please.
Right, this is coming from Salam Ismail, and he says, what kind of procedures and mechanisms is RSP going to implement to ensure the overall system is functioning in most efficient manner? I think that's what he's asking.
Right. So the provision of the district cooling system, we seek an outcome-based approach, as I was saying. So the district cooling operator is required to operate his plant as efficiently as possible. And the way that we collect information, as we have done for some time, we look at the efficiency of the production of the plant. We also look at cooling energy sales and the efficiency of production to sold energy. And we understand that that can be affected by things like low delta T or poor operation of the secondary system. And in terms of improving the efficiency of the system overall, the ECR focuses on the effective operation of the system from the district cooling provider. And I expect that ECR to allow district cooling companies to require building owners or secondary system operators, whoever they are, to operate their systems responsibly and in a coordinated manner with the district cooling operator. And that is a point that needs a bit more detail to be put into it, as I understand it at the moment from the feedback that we've had. I've mentioned a few times now the Building Energy Management Accreditation Scheme, and I think that has a very important role to play going forwards in terms of recognising competence on operating the secondary system and maintaining that to work with the wider district cooling system. So these are very much points that we are mindful of. We've got to deliver a whole system efficiency, and that means tackling both as best as we can. So I will move on to the standard contracts, standard agreements that we have just completed a consultation phase on. And as I was just saying, we've received a good response on this, and we're processing those responses, and that means we're really considering what to do given those responses. Now, the key thing about standard agreements is that the Executive Council resolution requires that permit holders must amend their existing contracts to comply with the standard contract. Now, that's a big deal, because the contracts that are out there at the moment are hugely variable in their content and in the clauses and the provisions that are in there. There are a number of parties involved, whether it be developers, district cooling companies and buildings and so on. And of course, there's the billing services that don't involve specifically the provision of chilled water, but they provide a billing service. and then there's the district cooling provision of chilled water. So our objective with this regulatory document has been to take two forms of contract, the billing services agreement and the district cooling services agreement, and to make those as flexible as possible, yet effective to try and drive the performance that we seek in regulating the sector. What we haven't done is provide or attempt to provide a standard concession agreement document that would require the district cooling providers and developers to revise their agreements on that scale. And we are very keen not to get into that area. So we can avoid that, then we will. I think it's an area that is hugely complex, and I believe we can get to where we want to be using just these two standard contracts. The design of them is very specific in that they are cross-referenced to other RD documents, such as metering and billing, or tariffs and charges, metering, charges and billing, or customer service, so that we can update those RD documents without having to replace all of the contracts as the sector evolves. And that's an important bit of flexibility that we've managed to build into them. That said, there are not unsubstantial challenges, and I'm just talking about two main challenges that we've had back on the consultation that we've gone through. The first one is on making ex post adjustments to contracted capacity. So it's one of the first things we spoke about this evening, and we have a significant excess capacity potentially at the building level, certainly at the system level, certainly, and we're keen to try and make better use of that. And that means providing the opportunity to reduce contracted capacity where it's simply not warranted, whilst protecting district cooling companies from building owners that seek to reduce their contracted load because they haven't achieved the occupancy or for some other reason. Excuse me. The other challenge that we've got back is this impact on concession agreements, and we're going through the details of that to really understand and appreciate whether there's a way that we can avoid having a knock-on effect into those concession agreements, or if such a knock-on effect is an acceptable point that we will deal with as we develop the regulations. So those are the standard agreements that we've consulted on. We haven't at this stage ruled out making a number of changes and then going back out to a second round of consultation. So that's still an opportunity for us to consider. And we are, I mean, this is a really important area for us to get right the first time. We don't want to be reissuing contracts in 2 years' time, or finding ourselves in the middle of next year with contracts that are driving all sorts of problems rather than serving the purpose that that we want them to. So it's a delicate area, and we're working on it, I think, is the current position for us.
James says this is a similar approach to what happened in the rent contract. You remember, every landlord used to have his format of rent, and it created a lot of dispute. And yes. When it was unified, I mean, it solved a big problem. Same in Abu Dhabi, you know, we rented an office, and the contract, they had to give him 1 month's notice. And I checked with my lawyer, he said it's fine. Then he raised a legal case, and he was used to it. But the law said it's 3 months, which I wasn't aware of. And he claimed 1 full year of rent. So I lost 155,000 because of different contract laws. Definitely what you are doing will improve our industry, will unify it, and will give it a more uniform and more understandable case for the end user. Because each time I'm getting 100 service contract, I mean, to review, and tell them, I mean, these are standard for this company. You cannot negotiate them. The only thing you could negotiate was the capacity. Beyond that, I mean, as a client, you don't have any negotiating power besides that. What you are doing is helping the client to get a fairer level of contract, and definitely this will improve our industry, and also it will give a balanced approach to the district cooling provider. I mean, this will not hurt the district cooling provider. It will assert their position that this is a unified contract in Dubai that we cannot change, and maybe simplify the negotiation process for future contracts. I believe so, as an industry, let's say, expert, and I believe that will help a lot.
Thank you. I agree. I think that certainly, I'm glad you mentioned the standard contract that RIRI used. I mean, that's essentially where we aim to get to with the billing services agreement. Something that's very short and simple, good for the customer to understand, and common across the sector.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's absolutely what we want to achieve.
Okay. Let's move forward.
Okay. Yeah, we have some questions, but maybe you can take it later.
Go on. I thought we might have some.
Can we assemble them, because he has a break point at the end and before the conclusion, to gain some time, Surendra?
Sure.
But
Okay.
I think you have 2-3 more slides. That's it.
Okay. We'll ask the questions towards the end.
Okay. Well, these ones are probably less contentious than the standard agreement. So RD5 concerns customer service. We've consulted upon a document, and we are now reviewing the feedback from that consultation process. Our objective here is really to set expectations. So the Executive Council resolution requires district cooling or service providers to submit for approval their procedures and processes for managing customer complaints, and it also requires them to deliver some standards in terms of their service. So what we've looked to do in advance of permit holders submitting customer management systems, we've called it a customer charter, and we've said this is what we expect permit holders to include in their customer charters, and it really sets out a requirement for them to demonstrate their commitment in terms of delivering customers that satisfaction and showing the value proposition to customers, and also to make that readily available and easily accessible to customers. In terms of the feedback, we haven't been challenged on a lot of the aspects of this. The one thing where we have had some common challenge was on the option to make it available. So the content of the consultation required this to be available through customer bills, which I had assumed to be online rather than in paper form. So a simple sort of cognitive gap perhaps, but what we expect to achieve is that companies will make online solutions available for their customers to contact them, to raise concerns, complaints, queries, and to set out how they will deal with those. Excuse me. Now, there's an important aspect of this is that there's a part of the Executive Council resolution that allows, as I mentioned at the beginning, the DSCE to set out a committee to handle disputes that are not resolved by permit holders. Now, if disputes aren't resolved by permit holders, that's considered to be a bit of a failure on behalf of well, let me rephrase that. If disputes are not resolved by permit holders and the committee formed by the DSCE consistently finds in favor of the customer, then that would begin to be deemed as a failure of the service provider in delivering its customer service. If the number of complaints comes to the DSCE and the DSCE finds in favor of the service provider, then that's just a bit unfortunate perhaps, but we're looking to minimize the number of complaints that come to the DSCE. It's a committee that's formed by the DSCE, but it consists of RSB staff, and there are 4 people in the RSB. So we don't really have the capacity to deal with the sort of complaints that come into district cooling companies as a whole and that are generated in the sector. So we're very mindful to make sure that these complaints are effectively managed and dealt with by the sector, and then not escalated to the DSCE. With that said, we understand that sometimes it's impossible to solve a complaint, and there are circumstances where escalation is required. So that's essentially the requirement for customer service that we're seeking.
Okay.
In terms of metering, billing and charges, it's another document that we've consulted on and we are reviewing. So these consultations ended in, I think, late September, which is why we've got 3 that are under review at the moment. This was a fairly concise consultation that looked to achieve some good charging practices and set expectations in terms of what charges, the form of charges in terms of, the form of charges from permit holders and what customers can expect to see in their bills. Not the quantity, but the format. We set out requirements for bulk meters and sub meters, and just some pictures on the right there. Maybe we oversimplified this in the consultation, but we will need to take more account of the complexities and the differences between the standards of bulk meters and sub meters. We had looked to have sealed units in use more widely. I think that's achievable for sub meters, but as you can see on the top diagram, that might be less pragmatic with bulk meters. The content of bills is fairly straightforward, and much of it is directly in the resolution itself. And the form of charges and deposits and fees was another area that we just set out some expectations. So the challenges, as I say, the minimum meter requirements I've just spoken about, and the charging for estimated reads. Well, we'd proposed something here. We've had a number of complaints where estimated reads are driving quite high bills, and so we wanted to try and address this in regulations. We proposed a way to calculate that. And actually, one company came back with an alternative suggestion that was better than ours. So we'll be proposing an updated proposal for estimating contract reads, because we think that it's more accurate and fairer to customers in each of the district cooling systems provided. So another benefit of the consultation, really, 2 heads are better than 1. And we had a number of feedback of companies' feedback on this point, but one company in particular provided an option that sounded better than ours. So we'll try and promote that. Moving on to Regulatory Document 7, which is data and reporting. We've yet to consult on it. It has been it's been in effect really for some time in terms of the district cooling companies. We're trying to provide effective and efficient monitoring, and we're trying to formalize the reporting requirements that we've been using over the last 8 or 9 years now, and also to bring into scope some reporting from billing agents. The content is actually the annual data returns for DC providers, and we're currently looking at tweaking that so that billing agents can provide very similar service, very similar returns. The one thing I would add to that is that between 2012 and 2018, 2018, we had a standard data return that evolved slightly. Then we reduced it drastically last year. Going forwards, it's going to be our proposal, which we will be consulting on, is a very slight increase on the 2020 return, because we'll still need system data, but it will be about a 2/3 reduction to the data that we've been requesting in the years between 2012 and 2019. So our objective here is really to minimize the burden on the sector. We don't want to be a drain on resources, but we do want to maintain our analytical capability of performance, and that's critical. So the reduction, I think we've been able to do that without dropping that analysis. So that's quite a positive move. I look forward to consulting on this and seeing the feedback from the permit holders and potential permit holders. I'll skip on to RD8. This one is, I don't think it's particularly contentious. We've yet to consult on it, but our objective really is obviously to monitor the performance of permit holders in terms of their health and safety and encourage best practice in the sector. And that applies to service providers and billing agents. We've already published and have had in operation health and safety performance reporting requirements for the independent water and power producers that we've regulated since way back when. And our proposal will be to expand, and indeed we have already drafted these ones, to expand to cover the permit holders in the district cooling sector. So we'll be issuing that consultation in the near future. And what we're essentially doing these are reporting requirements for health and safety, rather than getting into the detail of how you go about your health and safety. So it's again consistent with the light touch performance regulation, if you like. So in terms of the wrap up, I should just like to say that ECR 6 of 21 is in effect. It's been published in March 29th, earlier this year. The implementing regulations, the first one, RD1, is in effect. It's available on our website, and we have issued permits for those first ones that have been applied. And we're progressing with the development of the rest of the scheme. And the table on the right here shows the status summary of the RD documents that we've talked through this evening. Now, I just want to probably pop back and pick up questions if that's okay. And I think we stopped them here.
Sure. This one is coming from Mahik Hidden, and he's asking, is accreditation going to be voluntary or mandatory? That's the first question.
Okay, so accreditation in terms of the Building Energy Management Accreditation Scheme is currently optional, but at the moment it's a free service. There's no application fee. There is potential for that to become mandatory in terms of, but that's a decision really for RERA. They may say to their operating companies that you may only use companies accredited to operate the secondary system. They might, they haven't done as yet, but that is an option, and it's something that we've spoken about the potential of. It's been discussed. But currently that scheme is voluntary.
Okay. Next question is coming from. It's more of a there's questions and comments on this. This is coming from Bhakti Faisal Tahir, and he says, "Hi James, thanks for taking time out to speak to the market participants. A significant amount of capital has been invested in district cooling plants in the last 10 years, with developers recovering their investment over 25 years, which would mean negative financial impact. Are you keeping financial health and continued existence of current operators in mind? Secondly, would you have a different set of rules when it comes to ex-post changes for DC players who have used utility sector leverage of 80+% and might be out of business if you amend tariffs?"
Well, the first part of that question, I'll just go back to my slide here, which I mentioned, and I can't stress enough. Our objectives in the implementation of regulations is to support these three entities. And it's absolutely critical that we continue to have investment into the DC sector. And I hope that really answers his first question. Without investment, this whole initiative doesn't work. So we absolutely need to maintain an attraction to investors in the district cooling systems, not only to maintain the existing ones, but to support further growth. In terms of the second question, I wasn't quite clear on the leverage that he was talking about, but I can say that we are not the entity that is going to approve tariffs. So it will be a matter for the DSCE, and I don't really want to second guess what they will do. My personal opinion, I don't expect a massive change suddenly overnight when the DSCE is asked to approve the tariffs of existing schemes. I don't know what will happen, but I don't expect that to happen. In terms of new schemes, I think that provides a bit more potential for cost reductions. We look at the cost recovery of systems, and as we get a better understanding of the time in which costs are recovered for investment in DC systems and the depreciation and the whole financial models, then maybe we'll have a better understanding. But those side of things are not, I don't think they're going to happen overnight.
Okay. We have 12 minutes left before the scheduled close. This question is coming from Mike Eden again, and he's asking if design contract capacity between the district cooling provider and owner is proved through operation and energy consumption reduction to be significantly lower than contracted, will there be a possibility to amend it? So that's a question.
So let me just make sure I've understood that. If the contracted capacity is shown to be correct, but the energy consumption hasn't dropped, is that?
I believe, James, that if the actual capacity, let's say he contracted for 1,000 tons and the actual was 600 tons, is there room to reduce that contract?
Okay, so in the consultation for the district cooling services agreement, we had proposed that there was an opportunity to make an ex post adjustment to the contract capacity after a period of normal operation. That means after the building has had its full occupancy, its build out is complete. And if, when that time arrives, the actual peak consumption is short of the contracted capacity, there should be a facility for the building owner to reduce that contracted capacity. That's what we put in the consultation. And obviously that's in favor of the customer. To balance that, we said that where the customer exceeds his contracted capacity, the district cooling service provider would be able to charge a surcharge on the excess capacity. So there would be a sort of a windfall for them. Now, the feedback that we've had, I mean, the pushback we had on ex post adjustments has been in this area. And one of the things that perhaps we weren't clear enough in our consultation, we asked district cooling companies to take best endeavors, I think was the term we used, to make available to meet the demands of the customers. And I think we'll need to consider how we phrase that carefully, because we're not expecting district cooling providers to make or to have to incur any additional investment. If there is latent energy in the system and that can be used by the customer and he goes over his contracted capacity, then he will pay for the extra consumption that he's using, and he will face, under this proposed contract, an increased capacity charge. That's what we had intended from the consultation, and we've had a couple of companies come back and push back in the way that we've worded that, and we'll need to reconsider that. But on the other side of it, where customers are not using their contracted capacity, we had a bigger pushback in that we need to consider the financing mechanisms and how much of an impact this has on ensuring that the scheme is financeable.
Some of the providers allow 10% reduction in the contracted capacity if the client after 3 years proves that this is what he's using is much less. So in a way, right, I'm giving him some leeway, but not the full reduction. And yeah, I think maybe the regulation can act here as advisor, because the clients, when they build their buildings, they rely on their consultant to specify much higher capacity than needed. And the district cooling has data now. If we share this data, how much these buildings are consuming, then probably the building owner will be have better advice on how much he can sign in the future. As I said, majority of the buildings connected are already there as new buildings, but you never know. I mean, Dubai is aiming to reach to increase penetration to 30 or 40% in district cooling. So we might have more conversion to our industry.
I think it's a fair point, but the example you gave earlier, George, was a building is contracted for 1,000 tons and uses 600 tons. If you have a 10% reduction, then you're contracted for 900 and you're using 600. And that seemed to be the 10% to my mind at the time of drafting this standard agreement wasn't sufficient to adequately reflect the need for adjustment. And that said, I'm still very mindful of the other side to this. And as you've said, it's not the district cooling companies that are demanding that building owners contract to these loads, as I understand it. My understanding is that these contracted loads are coming from designers who are working and employed by the developers or the building owners.
Correct.
Now, if that's actually the case, then there is a school of thought, and quite legitimately, that would argue the building owners are creating their own problem by not challenging the designers that they employ to get those numbers right. And I mentioned earlier getting the contracted load right at the beginning, and we haven't got an RD document in place for that at the moment. And that's because we don't know if it's going to be an RD document, or if it's going to be guidance, or if actually it's going to be a case for the developers to
I have a proposal here, James. Maybe you can propose that there will be a mandatory approved third party that can look at these contracted capacity and advise both. I mean, what should it be?
I mean, there are a number of ways that we could try and tackle this, and I'm really not sure at this stage what the ultimate answer is. I mean, there was one suggestion that we try and make it obligatory that the cooling providers are accountable for determining the load of the building, and then they have this ex post adjustment that they're subject to, which is unlimited.
At least they should advise. I don't think that it's compulsory they give the number, but they can advise what should be the number at least.
Yeah, and in addition to that, we have to consider the building regulations by DM as well. So it's a very complex area, and I don't propose to say we've got it.
The time of signature, the owner is afraid and always try to push to the bigger numbers, and then when he sees reality, he is shocked.
Yes, yeah. But these developers aren't. They're not novices, and you know, there's a lot of established developers that really should have their own numbers and experience in this area as well. So there's two sides to that one, I think.
I see the people who has built like 10 or 15 projects of the same type never looked at the data before and kept looking at what consultant advised. Yes. You know, there are bad practices that we are hooked on. The other one is we have to work more as developer and get our numbers and question. We prefer to take the easy path. Let the consultant decide, and we. So this one. But even that said, and despite that, the capacity charges are much higher Still in Dubai, we see that the energy charges are about 60 to 70% of the district cooling charges. So the fixed charges is around 30 to 40%, while the meter charges are between 60 to 70%. And the owners can work a lot on that section. I mean, in terms of how they manage their fresh air, how they manage their pumping system, how they manage their building loads, and they can do a good job in reducing their bills.
Yeah, there's a lot of variation in Dubai in terms of the proportion of fixed charge and variable charge, but and there's a lot that can be done. It's a big area, and it will take more than the next 6 months to solve. So we will be working on.
We're left with 3 minutes. What do you advise?
Yeah, we just have 3 minutes left. Can we just take one question? And we have a few more questions, but we'll just take one. Rest we'll answer through the magazine later on. This question is from Dominic McPollen with the Ministry of Works in Bahrain, and he's asking, is there a regulation cross-referenced to the building permit to control opting out of contracts and reverting to conventional cooling?
No, there isn't. I think in Abu Dhabi, they have some regulations that look at that angle of things, but we have not proposed the option of opt-outs.
Okay. I think we need to conclude with this, George. You want to?
First, I want to thank you, James. This is a major step toward our industry, and I see the benefit it brings to the industry. Thank you for covering all the aspects of the regulation. You make it look simple for us to understand, and we hope what you are doing is a first good step that will you can build on and continue to improve our industry. And I would like to thank our audience and CPI for attending, and CPI for hosting such an important event for district cooling. And hopefully also this will have regional impact as well. And we will see more of that covering the entire region, like regulation Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, and Qatar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. And thank you, CPI, for hosting the event. It's been very helpful for us to be able to get our message out and explain how we've been progressing with things.
Thank you, James. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and for so patiently answering the questions. And George, thank you for so ably moderating this webinar. And thank you to the audience also for staying back and listening. Thank you all. And we hope to soon have one more webinar in this HVACR Industry Leadership Series, and we will be making an announcement through the magazine and other channels that we have. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.